The remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 cemented the franchise for a new generation by making something old feel undeniably fresh again. Released for PC, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in 2019 and in 2020 respectively, they helped recapture the classic survival horror elements of the series at a time when the franchise was pivoting towards first-person horror. It allowed for the legacy of 2005's Resident Evil 4 to shine through and establish its value once more at a time when its legacy was somewhat tarnished. I'm Tommy Thompson, welcome to part 3 of Revisiting Evil here on Design Dive. In this episode we're going to explore what makes the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 so compelling, how they build on the strengths of previous games, plus make evident the limitations of the originals, all the while creating something that still felt fresh and novel 20 years later. The remake of Resident Evil 2 came at a curious time in 2019, a pivot back towards the style of third-person action just 2 years after the release of Resident Evil Biohazard, which moved the series into first-person horror, with Resident Evil Village continuing the trend. But ignoring these first-person titles for now, given we'll be talking about them in the next episode, Resident Evil 2 is something of a course correction, an attempt to refresh classic Resident Evil at a time where it seemed like there was little appetite to return to it. In part 2 of Revisiting Evil, we explored the franchise's phase of third-person action, starting with 2005's Resident Evil 4, a game that sought to redefine the series in much the same way Biohazard did 12 years later. Resident Evil 4 is notable in how it reframes the 3 C's of Resident Evil's design, with the character being more intrinsically linked to the player, the camera providing a more natural perspective on the action, and the controls providing a means to act quickly while retaining the nature and feel of the original Resident Evil games. Despite the adoration and acclaim it has rightfully earned, Resident Evil 4 was also the source of the problem. This pivot towards a more terror-laden, action-focused Resident Evil results in the series deviating farther from its roots. As discussed in the previous video, Resident Evil 5 and 6 continued down this path, leaning more on the action elements, to a point that the series began to blend in with everything else being produced at that time. It's not hyperbole to say that Resident Evil 4 was a pivotal moment in the development of video games. It sits alongside Call of Duty as a franchise that defined action gaming for much of the mid to late 2000s and into the early 2010s. While RE4 can still distinguish itself from other games of the era, Resident Evil 5 and 6 struggled to establish an identity at a time when third-person action games were increasingly homogeneous, as new franchises such as Gears of War, Uncharted and Dead Space were not just riffing on the same ideas, but sometimes doing a better job of it than Capcom was. There's an argument to be made as to whether Resident Evil 4 is even a Resident Evil game, given it is markedly different from the earlier titles. However, as discussed in the previous video, it still retains the core principles of the original survival horror template, which we discussed at length in part 1 of Revisiting Evil. I'd argue, however, that the issue lies with how each subsequent entry diluted that formula. Hence, by the time we reach Resident Evil 6, it's difficult to reconcile this action-heavy, set-piece-driven experience with the more focused, isolated and tempered horror of the original games. It no longer felt like it was part of the same body of work. When the remake of Resident Evil 2 was released, it had been 7 years since Resident Evil 6, and while Biohazard helped reset expectations of the series in 2017, in the intermitting years we only had 2015's Resident Evil Revelations 2, which was okay at best, and 2016's disastrous Umbrella Corps, flying the Resident Evil flag. It seemed like the template established by Resident Evil 4 was now left behind. And this is what makes the remakes of 2 and 3 so interesting, in that they take the lessons learned from 4, 5 and 6 to deliver games that revisit the height of the survival horror era. To highlight how effective the remakes are, we need to start by looking at what they're derived from. Resident Evil 2 and 3 are built from the same template as the original game, both in terms of the 3 C's and the design pillars. Players see their character from fixed camera angles and take charge using an egocentric control system that makes it feel like you're driving a tank, with characters able to turn left, right, move forward or backward and ready up and use items. This was all one of the three core pillars of the original game, that the control of the character and the interaction with the world itself was a challenge to overcome. Meanwhile, the remaining pillars of non-linear exploration and item management also remain intact. Resident Evil 2 provides a new challenge that is nonetheless familiar. The Raccoon City Police Department acts in the stead of the Spencer Mansion to create a complex space full of tight corridors with challenges to overcome and puzzles to solve in many of the individual rooms. Heck, the lore of the series highlights that the police station is the city's former art museum, thus giving a justification for its complex, non-linear structure. Plus, the order of exploration of RPD, and even whether some rooms are accessible, is unique to your playthrough either as Leon Kennedy or Claire Redfield. Meanwhile, the original Resident Evil 3 is a slightly different beast, often with hubs of non-linear exploration surrounded by more linear segments, a concept that returns largely in Resident Evil 0, but for the most part, it retains the same core principles. The enemy designs are largely consistent with the original, with the return of zombies, dogs, crows, spiders, and even the hunter in Resident Evil 3. Often these are in close quarters, exploiting the design of either RPD or later the sewers and nest. Meanwhile, new enemies present unique challenges, perhaps the most interesting being the Licker, which has subsequently become an iconic enemy of the franchise. Lickers take the place of the Hunter from the original game in providing a fast and vicious opponent. But not only do they appear much earlier in this game compared to the original, they bring new challenges and opportunities. Given while they exhibit ranged attacks, they're also blind, meaning players can play smart in specific circumstances to get the drop on them. It all feeds on what was discussed in Part 1. The tight space, awkward controls and character orientation make the player prone to panic and mess up in the heat of the moment. And of course, there are the two standout enemies that appear in the remakes as well, Mr. X and the Nemesis, but I'm going to come back to them as we discuss the remakes themselves, given while they are highly celebrated, they often feel like the weakest part of their respective games. Unsurprisingly, the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 trade on nostalgia, relying not just on your working knowledge of the original versions of each game, but even of other games in the series. The 3 C's of the gameplay largely adopt that from Resident Evil 4, with the secondary item mechanic from the remake of the original Resident Evil, allowing you to interrupt enemy attacks. The map design of the Raccoon City Police Department is markedly similar to the original, but the order of exploration and a lot of the connectivity is changed to give a fresh and interesting feel, while the third floor is almost entirely original. Naturally then, with this knowledge of the new layout, the games introduce new challenges and variation, allowing for each playthrough as Leon and Claire to mix up the exploration and combat in much of the map. And this idea is exploited in the remake of Resident Evil 3 as Carlos visits the RPD in the search for Dr. Bard, complete with the same locker codes too. The remakes are successful in achieving their underlying design goal. They solve the problem that every game after Resident Evil 4 subsequently suffered from. They retain the balance of the original survival horror design, while also delivering on the change in perspective and interaction. The continued innovation of the industry in areas such as real-time rendering, environment design, and character animation allow the games to embody the true Resident Evil experience in a way that nothing prior to them truly could have. Really, the success of these remakes is down to 3 key elements. The reinvention of the third-person control system that feels fluid yet still provides a challenge, the increased agency and intelligence of many of the enemy characters providing a challenge that is familiar but also novel in some areas. And lastly, it leans on the horror pillars of the original games, all the while reframing previous ideas with these newly refreshed mechanics. This isn't to say it's all a slam dunk. Given these games are inspired from the originals, it leads to some pointed criticisms, given they often deviate from their 90s counterparts. Notably, Resident Evil 3 is more of a reimagining of the original than an outright remake. But also, the increased fidelity of the game's underlying systems and technical nuances leads to awkward concessions in the game's design that are often difficult to ignore. The most obvious change in the remake is the 3 C's, which have transposed from the original egocentric controls and fixed camera angles to something much more akin to that seen in Resident Evil 4. Though the real success here is that it handles like you remember Resident Evil 4, rather than how it actually played. If anything, it handles much closer to Resident Evil 6, with smoother dual-stick control and the ability to strafe, and even the option to move when the gun is aimed down sights. As discussed in Part 2, the over-the-shoulder perspective of Resident Evil 4 helps retain the claustrophobic nature of the original games, in that now you struggle to see what is immediately around you. This works well even in the tight corridors of the RPD, as poorly lit areas rely on flashlights, and you lose sight of even the tightest of spaces when aiming down the reticle. The tension builds given the accuracy of the shots only increases the longer you stay still, making it much easier to miss a shot even at medium range as the zombies barrel towards you. The most welcome improvement to this is the dodge from Resident Evil 3. This mechanic is inspired by the original game, in which the player can time a dodge that allows you to get out of an enemy's grasp. The application is different for each character, with Jill rolling to the side while Carlos shoulder charges. In each case, if you aim down sights immediately after, you get a focus assist that allows you to take shots at the enemy's weak spot for a limited period of time. It's a welcome addition to this third-person perspective, even if the focus mode is a little overpowered. Sadly, this is only introduced in the remake of RE3 and would have been a welcome addition in the remake of 2, especially given the tight corridors which often make it impossible for the player to proceed when filled with zombies. Speaking of zombies, let's talk about arguably the most important change made in the remakes, and that's the design of the enemy characters. We've already talked about the mechanics that allow you to overcome them, but let's dig into what makes them such a marked improvement. The zombies themselves are a great example of how to re-energize an existing concept, by keeping it fresh and interesting. Their pacing and attacks are largely the same as before, lunging to bite you when in range and capable of taking a chance either on foot or as they lumber around on the ground. But perhaps the most noticeable change is the use of animation-driven locomotion to make their movements feel more realistic. This is an approach that means that the movement of the zombies is now a reflection of the animations at play, rather than the character moving a fixed direction and playing the animation to suit. This is a complex process designed to plan out the movement of the character based on the kinematics of the animations. So now a zombie can stagger, falter, stumble, or shift its weight from one side to the other, and it all contributes to the movement in a way that is realistic and engaging. This enhances the combat of the game by making the targeting and shooting of zombies even more challenging. And in doing so, it increases the tension, while making them appear more realistic and scary to boot. It makes them all the more of a threat in tight spaces, as their movements are not as easy to predict or as broadly telegraphed as they were in previous games. Perhaps the most exciting element of the zombies is that they're able to smash open doors. In the original games, players could exploit the isolated nature of the map, rushing down the corridor into the West Office, knowing that the zombies outside cannot break in. Sure, there were a handful of cases where zombies entered rooms, but this was pre-scripted and often based on progression. Now the zombies are more akin to the Ganados in Resident Evil 4. While they can't climb ladders and such, the very fact that they can open doors or fall through smashed windows adds to the need for more tactical decision making. Simply running into the next room might be more of a problem than you first realised. Cause enough commotion and you can create bottlenecks, trapped in the safety deposit room with a bunch of zombies all dying to come in and eat your face. Meanwhile, the rest of the enemies largely operate as expected, with the lickers proving a threat as they smash through windows, climbing along ceilings and slashing you to pieces if you make too much noise. Dogs are able to use richer navigation to jump across many obstacles or atop objects to catch the player off guard, and the advanced zombies either in the Nest facility in Resident Evil 2 or those infected by the Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 add to the challenge with greater precision required with your shots. But of course, in amongst all of the other enemies we see across Resident Evil 2, the one that everyone talks about is Mr. X, the aggressive hunter that stalks players first across the Raccoon City Police Department and then farther afield. Originally an opponent who only appeared in the B playthrough of the original game, Mr. X is fleshed out to be a much more potent threat, demanding far more of the player's attention. Mr. X's modern design is notable in that he cannot be defeated until the narrative dictates it so. Heavy gunfire only stuns him, and he will continue to haunt the RPD both in early and latter stages of Resident Evil 2. Taking a page from the likes of Amnesia, Outlast and Alien Isolation, Mr. X is designed to impede progress, an adversary rather than an opponent that forces you to reevaluate how to head out and complete your next task. It plays on many of the tropes of horror games in recent memory, a character that teleports around the map when necessary and patrols seeking to catch sight of you. He travels from room to room of his own accord, and actually moves faster when in parts of the RPD that are not visible to the player. He reacts to noises made by the player and hones in on them, with his hearing becoming increasingly more sensitive the longer he goes without fighting you. And again, like many a horror antagonist, he has spawned in to create important moments, often with different events transpiring in both Leon and Claire's playthroughs. Mr. X is interesting from a gameplay perspective, given that while his AI is actually rather basic, he does something that no other part of the game can do. He forces you to re-evaluate how to reach different parts of the RPD. Rather than relying on your safest and most reliable route, you may be forced to take a different approach, one that now, because you completed an objective, has got more zombies coming in from a smashed window, or lickers are now patrolling the halls. This can create challenging moments as you're pushed around a corner, only to find a bunch of enemies you conveniently dismissed an hour ago becoming a new and significant threat once again. But sadly, Mr. X also exposes limitations of the original Resident Evil 2 design in ways that, once highlighted, diminish the overall experience. There are a handful of safe spaces that Mr. X cannot enter. Specific rooms such as the Dark Room, the Star's office, and the Chief's office. We know that the creature can move between rooms, but for balancing purposes, these rooms, most of which are save rooms, cannot be accessed by enemies, including Mr. X. There's a need to provide players a method of respite, and other horror games find ways to achieve this in a way that retains the overall core of the design. But it's a limitation of Resident Evil 2 that over time turns Mr. X into more of a nuisance than anything else, given the creature that can smash down walls cannot conceivably kill you when you sneak into an office at the end of the hall. Meanwhile, in Resident Evil 3, the Nemesis is a curious beast, a driver of the narrative, a focus of many a core set piece, but perhaps more frustrating and even disappointing when compared to Mr. X. One of the biggest tricks that the original game pulled off was to give the impression that the Nemesis was always catching up on the player, even though it only appears should the player complete certain events that further your progression through the game. You're led to believe that the Nemesis has locked in on Jill Valentine as its target, and in a manner akin to the Terminator, will simply not stop until she is dead. Man, why has nobody made a Terminator game like that? That could be super interesting to play. In the remake, the Nemesis does maintain this trend, but it's sadly rather short-lived. There are a handful of sequences in which the Nemesis is a real threat. In the opening hour, the Nemesis impedes the player's progress once the substation is activated and the metro trains need reconfigured. It's the highlight of the Nemesis in the entire game. It chases you down, knocking zombies out the way, trying to move in for the kill. As you move into areas it cannot follow, it will reappear in other areas of the map in different ways, blocking off different escape routes and forcing you to think on your feet. If you manage to give it the slip in an open area, it can jump over you and land in front of your path, forcing you to rethink it once again. Plus, it can infect zombies with the Nemesis parasite, making them all the more deadly as you try to make a break for it. Sadly, this aspect of the Nemesis design, which is arguably its most interesting, only really plays in the opening segment of the game in downtown Raccoon City. In fact, if you played the demo of the game prior to release, you've already experienced the most interesting element of the Nemesis. Unlike Mr. X, which continues to appear in the same mode of behaviour, for the most part, until its final boss battle against Leon, the design and application of the Nemesis shifts drastically. Once the player makes it back to the metro station after the train is programmed, the Nemesis stops acting in any way like that which was just described. It now acts as a mechanism for chase sequences, in a style akin to Call of Duty, in which the player need only run forward and trigger the occasional dodge to avoid being hurt, after which it becomes a mechanism for boss battles, with each changing in style and strategy on account of the creature's continued evolution into more monstrous forms, no longer being an adversary to overcome, but rather an animal that needs to be put down in increasingly elaborate ways. While it retains its original premise from the narrative, it ultimately feels a lot less interesting to play against than Mr. X, there is a conflict between the narrative function of the character and how it is subsequently employed in the design of the game. From the outset, the Nemesis is portrayed as a powerhouse, in that it smashes through buildings and lays waste to everything in its path in pursuit of its prey. In much of the game, this idea is retained, given the chase sequences and boss battles play into the creature's overwhelming strength, but the downtown segment proves to be an oddity, in that the behaviour design has to operate more akin to a slightly more powerful Mr. X in order for it to work. While these segments are fun, they are the least satisfying aspect of the game once you dig into it some more, given it feels like there's a lot more scope for a more aggressive version of the gameplay exhibited in Resident Evil 2 that does not ultimately amount to the player holding the sprint button. While there are grievances to be had with some aspects of the design, it's fair to say that the successes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 outweigh their failures and have helped establish third-person survival horror in the current market. I mean, I certainly had a good time playing through them, that's for sure. The remake of Resident Evil 2 has, as of mid-2022, sold approximately 10 million copies, only 1 million less than Resident Evil 7, but with 2 years less time on the market. This, combined with the generally strong critical reception, has led to something of a revival of the classic survival horror for a modern era, and this has had a wider impact on the games industry. While horror games have been in vogue for some years now, with Resident Evil 7 and 8 embracing the aesthetic and style of these more contemporary titles, it is easy to see how the remakes of 2 and 3 have impacted the market, given all you need to do is observe the upcoming release schedule. Naturally, there is the remake of Resident Evil 4, in essence bringing this whole exercise full circle, a point I will no doubt return to in the future, but there's more to consider beyond Capcom's own slate. Electronic Arts is publishing Motive Studios' remake of Dead Space, a series that was inspired by the original Resident Evil 4, and that's coming to PC and consoles in early 2023. Meanwhile, by the end of 2022, there is Callisto Protocol, a game led by the creator of Dead Space, not to mention Night Dive Studios' ongoing development of the remake of System Shock, plus the rumours of a remake of Silent Hill 2 being on the cards as well. Classic survival horror is in vogue once again, and it's Capcom's efforts that are largely responsible for this trend. Between these games and Resident Evil Biohazard and Village, the franchise is on solid ground once again, and is catering to two different styles of horror, and it's with that in mind we'll be diving into this new and terrifying phase of first-person horror in our next episode. Thanks for watching this third entry of Revisiting Evil. I'm actually quite happy you stuck around right to the end. Be sure to catch the earlier videos if you haven't already, or just any of the other stuff I do around here. I talk about AI and game design a lot, it seems. Special thanks to patrons for supporting me as I make all this stuff, and I'll see you all next time.